we move into chapter 6 in James Henson's book on deviance and social control. So I think there are going to be some things in here that you're going to find review for you, things we've already done, things we did when we talked about culture. We talked about all kinds of norms and things like that. And, I think what you're going to find is that for a lot of this stuff, we're just going to be talking about it in a different context. You learned about Irving Goffman's idea of stigma, and that is going to relate to the symbolic interactionist understanding of deviance. So let's move on. In the very beginning of the chapter, Henson gives you a little story, right? It tells you a little story. So remember what I said, that he always gives you these little stories at the beginning of chapters to kind of set up something really, really important in that chapter. And so for him, what the idea of the relativity of deviance, right? The relativity of deviance. Now, what he means by the relativity of deviance is that deviance is relative to the cultural context. So that means that deviance is going to be relative to cultural context cross-culturally, but also it's going to be relative to the context across different kinds of subcultures, and obviously, or I hope anyway, obviously, it's also going to be relevant to different historical contexts. So this little story at the beginning of the chapter is where Henson is saying this. He's saying that what Napoleon Chagnon considered deviant was actually normal to the Yanomamo. And he says, right, Henson says, what is deviant to some is not deviant to others. So it's not, this is again another quote from Henson, it's not the act itself, but reactions to the act that make something deviant. Very important idea, right? Very important idea. It is not the act itself, but reactions to the act that make something deviant. In other words, when something becomes deviant because it is defined that way by someone in some sort of cultural context. So I have here a picture of a movie poster from 1936, and this is a little film that was done out of Hollywood called Reefer Madness. And I'm doing this I'm showing you this to illustrate what we mean by this idea of the relativity of deviance. So back in 1936, and maybe 1936 for the next few decades, use of marijuana was thought of as extraordinarily deviant. And you had, again, this film here, which portrayed marijuana use not only as deviant, but as something that was partaken by deviant people who were crazy, okay? Smoke a joint and become psychotic and commit murder and all kinds of mayhem. And so that was the way we viewed it back then. Now we're going to put this, right, this next little picture here alongside of this slide. So this 1936, right, Reefer Madness, and now this is the world we live in. Marijuana use has become normalized, right? So this is we're saying that deviance is not only culturally relative, it's also historically relative. So one more time, right? It's not the act itself, but it's reactions to the act that make something deviant. So let's define deviance. How do we define deviance? Very basically, deviance is the violation of norms, right? Deviance is the violation of norms. Anything that violates norms is deviant, okay? Now, when sociologists use this term deviance, we use it in a sense that is non-judgmental. We don't use the term deviant or deviant or deviance in a sense that is judgmental. We simply use it in a non-judgmental way to describe people's responses to acts, right? How they define acts. So the term deviance is used by sociologists as referring to any act, right, to which people respond negatively. Now, alongside of deviance, we have the idea of crime. So for our purposes, crime is going to be a very specific form of deviance. It consists of the violation of legal norms. In other words, crime is the violation of law. So we have deviance, the violation of norms in general, and then we have crime, the violation of legal norms. Excuse me. And then I'm saying here that not everything is deviant is illegal. In other words, not everything that people consider deviant is illegal, and not everything that is illegal is considered deviant, right? So deviance, the world of deviance, or the universe of deviance and the universe of crime don't perfectly overlap. They overlap, but they don't perfectly overlap. So can anybody think of, or think to yourself, what is something that people may consider deviant, right, that isn't illegal? And can you think of anything that is illegal that isn't considered deviant but is considered normal? So, for example, if we look at something like adultery, that might be considered deviant, but it isn't necessarily illegal. Or if we look at, laws that say you have to wear a seatbelt, if you were stopped by an officer because you weren't wearing a seatbelt, I don't think anybody would consider you necessarily morally deviant, if that makes sense. So remember Goffman on stigma here, right? Stigma refers to characteristics that are defined as discrediting, okay? That's the important part, defined as discrediting. And actually, to be a deviant, a person doesn't even have to particularly do anything. It is when a stigma, for example, an undesired identity becomes the person's master status, that the person may be defined then as a deviant. All right, so deviance is the violation of norms. Crime is the violation of legal norms. Now, what about norms? Well, you know all about them. We talked about them when we were doing culture. Norms make social life possible, right? Norms make social life possible because norms make behavior more or less predictable. Because we understand or agree about norms, I can predict, I can more or less predict what you're going to do because I'm going to assume that you're going to adhere to norms. And more often than not, people adhere to norms rather than violate them. So if I'm in my car and I'm coming to a light and the light is green and I see somebody else coming from the other direction in the intersection, I know that they have a red light and I assume that they're going to follow the law, right? That they're going to follow the norm and they're going to come to a stop. So norms make social life possible because norms make behavior more or less predictable. Now, if we take all those norms together, all the various norms, all the formal norms, all the informal norms, and so forth, what we talk about then is the social order. Norms make up the social order. And the way we define the social order is that it refers to a group's customary social arrangements. So all of those norms, institutions, etc., laws, all that stuff, all go together to form the social order. Members of society depend on the social order, right? Our everyday lives are based on the presumption of social order. So norms, as you know, lay out basic guidelines. They're rules for how we should interact with others and how we should play our roles. So again, norms bring about social order. So that's important, right? Social order. We depend in our everyday lives on the social order. Now we get this other idea, social control. In order for society to work, there has to be a certain level of social control. In other words, assuring that people are going to follow the norms, right? So social control refers to a group's formal and informal means of enforcing its norms. Social order is reinforced then through the process of social control. So how do norms get enforced? They get enforced through sanctions. You know all about those too, right? So social control takes place through the administration of sanctions, and that these sanctions are either formal or informal. You already know what negative sanctions are, right? And you already know what positive sanctions are. And we can talk about how, these sanctions vary from very mild reactions, right, in informal contexts, and range all the way up to imprisonment and capital punishment within the context of the criminal justice system. Now, one type of social control is achieved through what we're going to call shaming, right? Shaming and degradation ceremonies. You already learned about degradation ceremonies. We talked about degradation ceremonies in the context of total institutions. And what we said was that within total institutions, a degradation ceremony operates as an initiation, right, of an inmate, right, into a total institution. Now we are describing a different function, right, of degradation ceremonies. This is going to be the use of degradation ceremonies to shame in order to promote social control, to punish deviance, right, and to act as a sort of incentive for people to obey norms. So shaming is a particular example of a negative sanction. And I think one of the things that we see is that, and one of the things Henslin talks about actually, is how in the age of the internet, shaming has made a kind of a comeback in society. So, here's some things from the internet, right? These are examples of efforts to shame, right? One effort to shame people who don't know how to park or who park badly, right? And the other one on the left here, right? The cheating husband, right? Public shaming, right? If you look at that, if you read that sign closely, you'll see that the gentleman's name is up there on that sign. Okay, so he's being publicly shamed. Now, Henslin points out that shaming typically is most effective when it's used in the context of primary groups, right? Or when it's used in the context of, I'm calling it a Gemeinschaft-like situation. In other words, a community type situation. Shaming works, or shaming is most effective, right? Shaming is most effective when it is applied within the context of a tightly knit community, what Tönnies called the Gemeinschaft, if you remember from the last chapter. Okay. So, the pictures that we have up here for cheating husband and the picture of the parking shaming, right, it is not much different than what you see here, okay, in this picture, right? This is an old picture of people in stocks in the like the 1600s, and that was the idea. This was the way that social control was exercised, right? In prior to industrialization, it was based primarily on things like shaming. So these people, this man and a woman, perhaps accused of adultery or something else, are put in the stocks, and you'll see some things on the ground here. So what you would do is they'd be in the public square in the stocks, and people would walk by and publicly ridicule them and yell insults at them and maybe throw stuff at them as well. So remember this picture, right? Remember this picture here as we go to the next slide. So here's some other examples of shaming. Right now, the difference between these pictures on this slide and the pictures on the previous slide are that these people are being shamed by order of a judge, right? And Henslin is telling us that shaming has made a kind of a comeback these days, right? There's been an increase of shaming on both the internet and also within the legal system. So look at these people here. I stole from a 9-year-old on her birthday. Right? Don't steal or this could happen to you. This was a judge sentenced this woman to this, to sit out in public with this sign. I am a thief. Right? I stole from Walmart. Okay, that's also, this woman is out here with this sign because she was sentenced by a judge. And these guys here, I was found guilty of disorderly conduct, right? I was found guilty of DUI. And again, these people were sentenced to public shaming by a court of law. So there really is, right, no difference between what you're seeing here. This is a 21st century version of that, okay? And Henslin says that we are coming back to that. We're seeing that more and more. But remember, we're not saying it isn't effective at all. But what Henslin is saying is that shaming is most effective in situations of tightly knit communities. All right. So let's move on to the next one. We have more examples of degradation ceremonies. We have more examples of public shaming historically. So here are some from World War II, right? Degradation ceremonies are used in public shaming. Not always, but very often they are. So we have here pictures of women who in France in World War II were accused of collaborating with Nazis, right, during World War II. So when the Americans and the British were liberating France, they were liberating all these towns. As soon as they were liberated in a lot of places, people who were accused of collaboration with the Nazis were rounded up. Some of them were just shot, put up against walls and shot. Others were publicly shamed. If you look very closely here, all right, I'm going to draw this little circle here. It's really hard to see, but that word is the French word for a woman collaborator. Okay, and you see the women. Think of degradation ceremonies in total institutions. How often do those degradation ceremonies involve the cutting of hair? And look what they've done to these women. They've shaved their heads. This woman has had a swastika shaved into her head. This woman has had her head shaved and she's having a swastika painted on her forehead. Okay, so degradation ceremonies used like this are explicit attempts to brand somebody as an outsider, calling upon individuals to account for their behavior to a group. So We have, the example of the shaming of Nazi collaborators in France during World War II, but also even today, certain court martials in the military involve public shaming. Okay, so we're going to take a little break there. I'm going to call that the end of part one, and we'll continue with our discussion.